This video is going to be the first video in this series about diseases affecting the respiratory system. So as normal, we are going to have a very brief discussion about the respiratory system. And mainly we're going to focus on the parts of the respiratory system that these pathogens are going to be able to get into and colonize and then affect. And so the upper respiratory is going to be comprised of the nose, the throat, and structures associated with those parts. The lower respiratory system is going to be the larynx, the trachea, bronchial tubes, and alveoli. And the lower respiratory system is nearly sterile. So if there's anything going on with that part of the body, we do always assume that there's an infection. And another structure associated with the respiratory system that we're going to talk about are those ciliary escalators. So remember, some of the cells in this body system are going to have cilia. And cilia are those little hair-like projections on eukaryotes like us that move things. And in this case, it pushes like mucus and things up and out of this system. So let's go ahead and get started on some of these diseases. So streptococcal pharyngitis, which is a very sciencey way of saying strep throat, is caused by Streptococcus pyogenes. If you've ever had strep throat, you know it's not very pleasant. The throat gets really sore. There tends to be these white pus pockets along the back. Sometimes you'll have, swollen tonsils and tender lymph nodes, and even like an earache can be associated with strep throat sometimes. So we've already talked about Streptococcus pyogenes and all of its virulence factors back when we talked about skin diseases. So just know this organism still has all of those virulence factors. We're just not going to get into them all over again. What is important is that if left untreated, these throat infections can actually cause much more serious complications. So it can either be right away or even weeks after the sore throat symptoms go away. Some people can get scarlet fever. And so this happens if the strain of Streptococcus pyogenes is infected with a bacteriophage. So remember, transduction. And the virus is giving the bacteria the ability to make the erythrogenic toxin. And so how can you determine if somebody has scarlet fever? Well, normally the patient is going to get this like sandpaper-like rash all over their chest, their neck, sometimes even on their elbows and inner thighs. There's going to be a high fever, but most easily to diagnose, in my opinion, is the appearance of a strawberry tongue, as you can see in that bottom right picture. And so the strawberry tongue is really kind of the key diagnostic indicator. And lucky it's pretty quick, right? Just, hey, stick out your tongue, kid, and boom, and there it is. Worth mentioning here when we're talking about scarlet fever is going to be the virulence factor C5a peptidase, which is going to go after complement protein C5a. And the end result of this is it's actually decreasing the number of white blood cells that get to the infection. And so that can just make it harder for it to get cleared by the immune system. And also, just harder for it to, or longer, I should say, a longer time for it to become cleared. But I guess we can take a few seconds to remind you of some of the other important virulence factors. So remember, this organism has that hyaluronic acid capsule, so it's trying to mimic the host. It has that liponucleic acid, which helps with adherence. It's got that M protein that also helps with adherence. It can also resist phagocytosis. And then it's got some streptolysins that are going to lyse the red blood cells, which we talk about with blood agar plates in the lab. And actually, some of these toxins that Streptococcus pyogenes can produce can act as super antigens, which means it's going to overstimulate the immune system. So our immune system goes into overdrive and it can result in shock or death. Next up is diphtheria, and this is caused by the bacteria, Corynebacterium diphtheriae. And until about 50 years or so ago, diphtheria was actually one of the most common and important causes of childhood death worldwide. Okay, but courtesy of vaccinations, and it's part of DTaP, it's the D, diphtheria, it has drastically reduced the number of diphtheria cases. So that's, another pat on the back for vaccines. So this disease is a result of the production of the exotoxin known as diphtheria toxin. And Corynebacterium diphtheriae as an organism is a club-shaped bacterium. So it's relatively easy to recognize under a microscope. So that's worth noting. So what are some of the signs and symptoms associated with diphtheria? So the symptoms normally begin in the upper respiratory tract. So you're going to see things like a sore throat, lack of appetite, even a low-grade fever, right? Surprise, surprise. But what's going to stand out? Well, in the bottom picture, you can see what's called a pseudomembrane. And that pseudomembrane is going to form on the tonsils or the pharynx. And it's actually formed by the bacteria, and this pseudomembrane contains bacterial cells, fibrin, lymphocytes, dead tissues, and this pseudomembrane is going to adhere to the tissues, right? So it can't easily be removed. It's like actually kind of like a leathery membrane, so trying to remove it can actually result in pulling at the tissue. So it's really painful, and it can actually block respiration. So it does get to a point where the patient is unlikely to recover. And it is possible for the diphtheria toxin to enter the bloodstream and travel all over the body. Okay, so because, again, we're dealing with an intoxication issue, taking antibiotics isn't going to do anything because we're not worried about the presence of Corynebacterium or necessarily how many Corynebacterium are in the body. It's the potent exotoxin. So there can be only a handful of bacterial cells, but that exotoxin is able to just cause mass chaos within the host. So again, antibiotics aren't really effective in treating this particular disease. The vaccine is really the key to preventing this disease from ever occurring. And again, because it's the exotoxin that we're worried about, the diphtheria is a toxoid. This toxin, toxoid, because it's trying to prevent the exotoxin from being able to do its thing should you ever encounter it in the real world. All right, we're going to wrap up this video with a brief chat about the common cold, and often associated with the common cold is otitis media, which is an earache. And so people often, especially with COVID, you see a lot of people going, why don't we have a vaccine for the common cold? It affects a lot of people. Granted, it's not normally lethal, but it's been around forever. Why don't we have a vaccine now for this? But we have one for COVID, right? Chaos. Not really, because the cold is a bunch of very general, non-specific symptoms, right? You're really just uncomfortable. And so there are lots of organisms, especially viruses, that can cause these just general non-specific symptoms. So there are over 200 viruses that we already know about that cause the common cold, which really means it causes those common cold symptoms. And there are plenty of others that we don't even know about yet. So trying to create a vaccine that's going to target all 200 plus of these causative agents is just not logical. It's also really just not necessary because, again, you tend to just be uncomfortable when you have a cold. So As we're exposed to different pathogens, right, we are building up our immune response so that we don't get the common cold quite as often, right? But as you encounter some of the other culprits, you can still get the cold. And then with an earache, again, it can be a result of the common cold, because as pus forms, it causes this pressure buildup against the eardrum becomes inflamed, right? And then you've got pain in your ear. And notice there's a variety of bacteria that are associated with an earache. But S. pneumoniae is the leading cause of earaches. And so the vaccine against that organism does decrease the number of S. pneumoniae related earaches that we see. All right, that's going to be the end of this video.